Welcome to The Know, I'm Mika.
I'm Ben.
A major game from EA and Bioware hasn't even released yet, but in advance of all that, some of its devs are already trying to soothe the fears of jittery gamers. The game we're referring to is Anthem, the sci-fi RPG that both EA and Bioware are really hoping is a hit, given some of their recent flops like Mass Effect Andromeda, Happy End 7 Day.
Sweet. Do you want to guess what this might be with EA? Just like one guess.
Does it start with L and end with LOOTBOXES?
It does end in LOOTBOXES. But while it isn't due out until next year, the big controversy in 2017 is LOOTBOXES and how they're implemented in games. And the creative director of Anthem briefly chatted with fans about their concerns over LOOTBOXES and microtransactions and how they'll be implemented in the game.
And while he didn't give any concrete answers as to how LOOTBOXES will be dealt with in Anthem, just the fact that a high-up official took the time to address the issue with fans is a sign that this is an issue that pretty much every big game is having to deal with right now.
Well, at least they're listening. Okay, here's a little background first. If you're not familiar with Anthem, it's the big new IP from Bioware that's set to release next year. The sci-fi RPG is a huge focus of the company, especially after the tepid response to Mass Effect Andromeda prompted Bioware and EA to cancel any future DLC and shut down its studio, Bioware Montreal. As a franchise, Mass Effect has now been put on ice for the foreseeable future, so yeah, it's safe to say that Bioware has a lot riding on Anthem.
That brings us to a Reddit thread from a few weeks ago that's been making the rounds lately. It was about, you guessed it, loot boxes in Anthem, and the poster was worried about what they might look like in the game. Yep, we've got another loot box controversy on our hands, and this one involves a game that isn't even done or out.
Cool. The Reddit poster referenced other AAA games like Middle-earth: Shadow of War and another upcoming EA game, Star Wars Battlefront 2, saying that large publishers are finding new and innovative ways to jam loot box incentive microtransactions further down their consumers' throats. This is a worrying trend and bodes poorly for the future of big-budget games.
That prompted a response from Brennan Holmes, who is the creative director on Anthem. He wrote, "I hear you. We're talking a fair bit about this at the moment. I can't really talk about it too much, but it's an ongoing discussion."
He then responded to another fan who asked, "What is the worst form of monetization you've seen in video games?" Holmes responded, "I think it has more to do with the philosophy around it. The first thing that most people do is look at the value of the sweat currency as compared to the premium currency. Personally, I prefer games where the ratio is somewhat reasonable. In other words, I can reasonably acquire currencies to purchase things through regular play. Personally, I also don't like it when some things are only available for premium purchase."
So there you go. At least one developer hates pay-to-win models, so yay!
We got one.
We got one
on our side.
And Holmes popped up on another Reddit thread recently, this one titled, "Is Anthem going to be lootbox central?" Again, the fear from gamers is that this game might just be chock full of loot boxes. So one responder to that post mentioned comments from another Bioware staffer, Manveer Hare, who recently spoke out against pervasive microtransactions in games and said that linear single-player games at EA are dead for the time being. Holmes responded to that saying, "I understand Hare's perspective, but I think he may be misinterpreting a lot of things, and he's definitely not in the know when it comes to Anthem. He was never on the team."
Of course, loot boxes have been an ongoing controversy this year, as they've been popping up in not just Shadow of War and Battlefront 2, but also Forza Motorsport 7, Destiny 2, NBA 2K18, and a lot of other AAA games. And while loot boxes make publishers a lot of money, the main concern of gamers is that some loot boxes contain character progression items, which means that some players can just pay for better gear, rather than grinding in the game. That was a big issue in the Battlefront 2 beta when gamers noticed better gear walled off behind loot boxes, which prompted EA to respond and promise changes.
Loot boxes have gotten so controversial that now we're even seeing some developers announce ahead of time that their games don't have them. We saw that recently with Monster Hunter World, where series producer Ryozo Tsujimoto told GameSpot that he doesn't like the idea of players paying to avoid parts of the game. He said, "We want people to have the experience that we've made for them rather than the option to skip the experience, so
Two developers.
Good
Two developers
going.
in our corner.
That is a whole two."
And the devs behind the upcoming Warhammer Vermintide 2 also said that they won't use purchasable loot boxes. Three! A community manager for the studio summed it up this way on Reddit: "Loot comes from gameplay, not your wallet." Meanwhile, the developers of Assassin's Creed Origins said before its release that while their games do have loot boxes, they don't cost real money.
So we'll go with 3.5?
Yeah, 3.5. I'll take it.
So there's definitely a trend right now of developers trying to get out in front of the controversy and being upfront with gamers to avoid any surprises or mobs with pitchforks.
I'll put mine away.
Oh, good.
On the other hand, there are other examples like Need for Speed Payback, Forza 7, and Battlefront 2, games that do have loot boxes, but don't necessarily announce it ahead of time and leave it up to the players to find out for themselves. It's worth mentioning that in all of those cases, it hasn't gone very well.
Mentioning those pitchforks that we talked about
I'm
earlier.
gonna go get my pitchfork again.
There we go. There are also games like Destiny 2, which are kind of loot box light games with loot boxes that cost real money, but only contain cosmetic items. Overwatch did the same thing too, and both games have been successful, and I've paid money for both.
Let's just not talk about it.
Okay.
So, who knows? That might be the approach that Anthem ultimately goes with. In his comments on Reddit, Holmes also seemed to indicate that the game's developers might not be too crazy about loot boxes. He wrote, "And if it helps at all, we're gamers too. A bunch of folks on the team have similar positions on monetization. So that perspective is definitely represented."
At the end of the day, even though loot boxes are here to stay, at least gamers' voices actually are being heard on this issue. And in the case of Anthem, which is a game that both EA and Bioware have a lot riding on, it looks like they're paying as much attention as possible to the fans, maybe in the hopes of avoiding a backlash, because all the loot boxes in the world don't matter if nobody gives a fuck.
What do you guys think about Anthem's creative director talking about loot boxes? Is it encouraging? Let us know in the comments.
And for all of your video game news, be sure to like this video, and if you're new around here, subscribe to the Now.
While it isn't due out until next year, the big controversy in 2017 is loot boxes and how they've implemented in games. And the creative director of Anthem briefly... how they're implemented in games, alright. Bodes poorly for the future of big budget games.
That prompted a response. It's Brennan, not Brendan, right?
You're doing really good at making up words.
Yeah.